Picture this. Young Simba stands beneath a canopy of stars, tears streaming down his face as his father's spirit appears in the clouds. Mufasa's majestic voice echoes through the night. "You are more than what you have become." It's one of Disney's most powerful moments, a scene that has moved audiences to tears for decades. But what if this entire spiritual experience is nothing more than an elaborate psychological manipulation? The great kings of the past represent the cornerstone of Pride Land's spirituality. Every major character references them. Every crucial decision gets their supposed blessing. Every moment of doubt gets resolved by their convenient intervention. But here's the disturbing pattern that emerges when you examine these encounters closely. The great kings never ever challenge the existing power structure. They never question royal authority. They never suggest that maybe, just maybe, the current system needs changing. Think about every single appearance of the great kings throughout the Lion King franchise. Mufasa appears to Simba when the young lion needs to reclaim his throne. The kings provide guidance when Rafiki needs to convince someone to follow a predetermined path. They offer comfort when characters question their royal duties. Notice what they don't do? They never appear to suggest that lions should share power with other animals. They never indicate that the monarchy itself might be flawed. They never challenge anyone to think beyond the established order. This isn't coincidence. This is the hallmark of a control system designed to maintain the status quo while giving the illusion of divine approval. Consider who benefits most from the great king's mythology. The royal family maintains their legitimacy through claims of ancestral blessing. Rafiki holds enormous political influence as the sole interpreter of these supposed spirits. The entire Pride Lands hierarchy remains unchallenged, because questioning it would mean questioning divine will itself. When characters struggle with royal responsibilities, the great kings conveniently appear to remind them of their duty. When someone challenges royal authority, they're positioned as going against the wisdom of the ancestors. The timing of these spiritual encounters reveals their true nature. Simba sees his father only when he's on the verge of embracing his responsibilities as king. The kings provide guidance precisely when characters need to make choices that benefit the existing power structure. They never appear during moments that might lead to systematic change or revolutionary thinking. But perhaps the most telling evidence lies in who controls these encounters. Rafiki serves as the primary conduit to the great kings, positioning him as an indispensable spiritual advisor to the royal family. This mandrill possesses the power to interpret signs, summon visions, and provide divine context for earthly events. In any political system, the person who claims to speak for the gods wields tremendous influence over those who rule. The psychological manipulation becomes even more apparent when examining how the great kings target characters at their most vulnerable moments. Simba encounters his father's spirit while drowning in guilt and self-doubt. Kiara receives guidance when struggling with the weight of royal expectations. These aren't random spiritual visitations. They're precisely timed interventions designed to guide traumatized characters toward predetermined conclusions. Notice how the great kings never provide practical solutions to complex problems. They offer vague wisdom about destiny and duty, but never specific guidance about governance, justice, or social reform. Their messages consistently redirect characters away from questioning systemic issues and toward accepting their predetermined roles within the existing hierarchy. The most chilling aspect of this spiritual control system is how it exploits grief and trauma. Characters who have lost loved ones become particularly susceptible to messages from beyond, desperately wanting to believe their deceased family members continue watching over them. This emotional vulnerability gets weaponized to ensure compliance with royal expectations and societal roles. Even the visual presentation of these encounters suggests manufactured, rather than genuine spiritual experiences. The great kings appear in clouds that form through entirely natural weather patterns. Their voices emerge from wind and thunder, phenomena that occur regularly in the African savanna. The timing of these events coincides with atmospheric conditions that any knowledgeable observer could predict. What emerges from this analysis is a disturbing picture of systematic deception designed to maintain political control through spiritual manipulation. The great kings serve not as genuine ancestral spirits, but as a sophisticated tool for ensuring that power remains concentrated in the hands of those who already possess it. The question isn't whether these encounters feel real to the characters experiencing them. It's who benefits from ensuring they continue believing in this carefully constructed illusion. To understand how this spiritual deception operates, we must examine its primary architect, Rafiki. This seemingly wise mandrill holds more political power than any character in the Pride Lands, yet his influence remains largely invisible because it's cloaked in spiritual authority. Rafiki doesn't rule through force or royal bloodline. He controls through claimed divine connection, making him perhaps the most dangerous figure in the entire Lion King universe. Watch Rafiki's behavior patterns across the films. He consistently appears at moments of political crisis, armed with convenient spiritual interpretations that guide characters toward specific actions. When Simba refuses to return to the Pride Lands, Rafiki doesn't engage in political arguments about duty or justice. Instead, he manufactures a spiritual encounter that bypasses rational thought entirely. This isn't wisdom. It's psychological manipulation disguised as divine intervention. The mandrill's knowledge of natural phenomena allows him to orchestrate these supposedly supernatural encounters. He understands weather patterns, animal behavior, and atmospheric conditions well enough to predict when circumstances will align for dramatic effect. Those clouds that form Mufasa's face? Rafiki knows when wind patterns and humidity levels create the perfect conditions for such formations. That voice in the wind? Sound carries differently under specific atmospheric conditions, and Rafiki has spent decades studying these natural acoustics. But Rafiki's manipulation extends beyond environmental knowledge. He employs classic techniques used by spiritual leaders throughout history to maintain psychological control over their followers. He speaks in riddles and metaphors that can be interpreted multiple ways, ensuring he's never technically wrong regardless of outcomes. He positions himself as merely a messenger, deflecting responsibility for the guidance he provides while maintaining his influence over decision-making processes. Consider how Rafiki's interventions always support existing power structures. When Simba struggles with his role as king, Rafiki doesn't suggest alternative forms of governance or power-sharing arrangements. Instead, he reinforces the divine right of royal bloodlines through manufactured encounters with supposedly deceased monarchs. When Kiara questions royal traditions, she receives spiritual guidance that ultimately leads her back to accepting her predetermined role within the monarchy. The royal family's complicity in this system reveals the collaborative nature of this deception. Mufasa, Simba, and other kings don't passively benefit from the great king's mythology. They actively participate in perpetuating it. They reference ancestral wisdom when making difficult decisions, lending credibility to the spiritual framework that legitimizes their rule. They defer to Rafiki's interpretations, knowing that his spiritual authority reinforces their political power. This creates a symbiotic relationship between religious and royal authority. Rafiki needs the monarchy to maintain his position as spiritual advisor, while the kings need Rafiki's divine interpretations to justify their decisions and maintain popular support. Neither can afford to expose the other's deceptions without undermining their own power base. The timing of Rafiki's spiritual interventions reveals their calculated nature. He never provides guidance during peaceful periods when characters might have time to think critically about their situations. Instead, he appears during moments of crisis, trauma, or emotional vulnerability when rational thought becomes compromised. This isn't coincidence, it's strategic manipulation designed to bypass critical thinking when people are most susceptible to suggestion. Examine Rafiki's interactions with characters who challenge the established order. When Kovu initially resists his predetermined role, Rafiki doesn't engage with his legitimate concerns about the system that created his circumstances. Instead, he orchestrates spiritual experiences that redirect Kovu's energy away from systemic critique and toward personal transformation within existing structures. The psychological techniques Rafiki employs mirror those used by cult leaders and authoritarian spiritual figures throughout history. He isolates characters during their most vulnerable moments, provides them with emotionally overwhelming experiences that feel profound and meaningful, then guides them toward predetermined conclusions while they're still processing these intense encounters. Perhaps most disturbing is how Rafiki exploits parental relationships to maintain control. He uses the deep emotional bonds between parents and children as leverage for manipulation, knowing that characters will do almost anything to feel connected with lost loved ones. When Simba sees his father in the clouds, he's not experiencing genuine spiritual contact. He's being emotionally manipulated through his unresolved grief and guilt. The mandrill's knowledge of each character's psychological vulnerabilities allows him to tailor his manipulations for maximum effectiveness. He knows exactly which emotional triggers will produce desired responses from specific individuals. With Simba, he exploits guilt and daddy issues. With Kiara, he leverages her sense of duty and desire for approval. Each manipulation gets customized to exploit particular psychological weaknesses. What makes Rafiki's deception particularly insidious is how he positions himself as merely a humble servant of higher powers. He claims no personal authority, instead presenting himself as a conduit for divine wisdom. This deflects suspicion while allowing him to wield enormous influence over royal decision-making processes. Characters trust him because he appears to have no personal agenda, when in reality, his agenda is maintaining the system that grants him unprecedented access to power. The evidence suggests that Rafiki and the royal family have established an unspoken agreement. He provides spiritual legitimacy for their rule, while they maintain his position as indispensable advisor. This arrangement ensures that both parties benefit from perpetuating the great king's mythology, regardless of the psychological harm it inflicts on those who genuinely believe in these fabricated spiritual encounters. Let's examine the most iconic spiritual moment in Disney history through a scientific lens. When Simba encounters his father in the clouds, audiences witness what appears to be a genuine supernatural event. But frame-by-frame analysis reveals something far more mundane: sophisticated manipulation of natural atmospheric phenomena combined with powerful psychological suggestion. The cloud formation that supposedly resembles Mufasa follows predictable meteorological patterns. In the African savanna, thermal updrafts create specific cloud shapes during temperature transitions between day and night. These formations occur regularly, but most observers don't interpret them as faces because they lack the psychological priming that Simba receives. Rafiki's presence during this encounter isn't coincidental. He's been monitoring atmospheric conditions and waiting for optimal visual circumstances. The voice that Simba hears carries through wind patterns that experienced naturalists can predict with remarkable accuracy. Sound travels differently under various atmospheric conditions, and the mandrill has spent decades studying these acoustic properties. What Simba experiences as his father's voice is likely Rafiki's own vocalizations, projected through natural echo chambers and atmospheric acoustics that disguise their true source. Consider the psychological state of characters during these supposed spiritual encounters. Simba is processing intense guilt, grief, and identity confusion when he sees his father. These emotional conditions create heightened susceptibility to suggestion and pattern recognition. The human brain, and presumably the lion brain, actively seeks meaningful patterns during times of stress, often finding significance in random events that align with existing emotional needs. Confirmation bias plays a crucial role in maintaining belief in these spiritual encounters. Once characters accept the initial premise that the great kings communicate through natural phenomena, they begin interpreting ordinary events as divine messages. A particularly beautiful sunset becomes ancestral approval. Wind patterns during important moments get read as spiritual guidance. This psychological mechanism ensures that believers continue finding evidence for their spiritual framework, regardless of actual supernatural activity. The power of suggestion becomes even more apparent when examining how these encounters get prepared. Rafiki doesn't simply point to clouds and claim they contain spirits. He creates elaborate emotional build-ups, guiding characters through psychological journeys that prime them for spiritual experiences. By the time the actual miracle occurs, subjects are already emotionally prepared to interpret ambiguous stimuli as profound spiritual contact. Grief psychology explains why bereaved characters become particularly susceptible to these manipulations. When someone loses a loved one, their brain continues seeking connection with the deceased person. This neurological pattern makes grieving individuals extremely vulnerable to anyone claiming they can facilitate continued contact with lost family members. Rafiki exploits this natural psychological response to maintain control over emotionally compromised characters. The environmental staging of these encounters reveals careful planning rather than spontaneous divine intervention. Notice how spiritual visitations always occur in locations with optimal acoustic and visual properties. Remote areas where sound carries in specific ways. Elevated positions that provide clear views of weather patterns. These aren't random spiritual meeting places. They're carefully selected venues that enhance the dramatic impact of manufactured supernatural experiences. Weather prediction in pre-industrial societies required extensive knowledge of natural patterns and environmental signs. Rafiki possesses exactly this type of expertise, allowing him to anticipate atmospheric conditions that will create visually dramatic effects. His ability to predict when clouds will form interesting shapes or when wind patterns will carry sound in particular ways gives him the power to orchestrate apparently miraculous events. The seasonal timing of major spiritual encounters follows predictable patterns related to animal behavior and environmental cycles. Characters experience divine guidance during migration periods, seasonal transitions, and other natural events that any experienced naturalist could anticipate. This timing makes the encounters feel cosmically significant, while actually reflecting Rafiki's deep understanding of natural rhythms. Examine how the circle of life concept gets weaponized to prevent critical thinking about social structures. This philosophy sounds profound and spiritual, but it essentially argues that existing hierarchies represent natural order that shouldn't be questioned. Predators rule prey because that's the natural way. Kings rule subjects because that's how the circle functions. Any attempt to change these relationships gets framed as disrupting cosmic balance rather than pursuing social justice. The circle of life narrative conveniently ignores how actual ecosystems function through complex interdependencies rather than simple hierarchical control. Real predator-prey relationships involve sophisticated balance mechanisms that prevent any single species from dominating others completely. The Pride Lands version presents a simplified power structure that benefits those already at the top, while convincing everyone else that their subordination serves some greater cosmic purpose. Even the visual effects during spiritual encounters follow laws of physics rather than supernatural intervention. Light refracts through atmospheric moisture in predictable ways. Sound waves bounce off rock formations according to acoustic principles. Temperature differentials create air currents that move objects in seemingly meaningful patterns. Every apparently miraculous event has a scientific explanation that Rafiki understands and exploits. The psychological impact of these fabricated spiritual experiences extends far beyond their immediate effects on target characters. Witnesses to these encounters spread stories throughout the Pride Lands, creating a network of believers who reinforce each other's faith in the great king's mythology. This social proof mechanism ensures that the deception becomes self-perpetuating, with each new believer adding credibility to the overall spiritual framework. Perhaps most telling is how these spiritual encounters never provide information that Rafiki couldn't have obtained through ordinary observation and deduction. The great kings never reveal hidden knowledge or predict genuinely unforeseeable events. Their guidance always reflects wisdom that an experienced observer could develop through careful study of animal behavior, environmental patterns, and political dynamics. The scientific deconstruction of these supposed miracles reveals them as sophisticated combinations of natural phenomena, psychological manipulation, and environmental knowledge. What characters experience as profound spiritual contact represents nothing more than calculated exploitation of their emotional vulnerabilities during moments when critical thinking becomes compromised by grief, trauma, or overwhelming stress. The true horror of the great king's deception isn't just that it manipulates individual characters, it's that it systematically prevents an entire society from evolving beyond primitive power structures. This spiritual framework serves as the ultimate tool of social control, convincing entire populations that questioning authority means defying divine will itself. Every revolution that never happens, every reform that gets abandoned, every voice of dissent that gets silenced, they all trace back to this carefully constructed mythology. Look at how the great king's mythology handles social inequality throughout the Pride Lands. Predators rule over prey animals not through superior governance or earned respect, but because the circle of life supposedly demands this hierarchy. The lions maintain their position at the top of the social structure by claiming ancestral blessing for their dominance. Any animal who questions why lions deserve automatic leadership gets told they're disrupting cosmic balance rather than pursuing legitimate political reform. This spiritual justification for inequality serves the same function as divine right monarchy throughout human history. Kings claimed God chose them to rule, making opposition to royal authority equivalent to rebellion against heaven itself. The Pride Land system operates on identical principles, using the great kings as divine validators for whatever power arrangements benefit the ruling class. Characters can't challenge royal decisions without challenging the wisdom of supposedly omniscient ancestors. The psychological impact of this system extends far beyond individual manipulation. It creates learned helplessness throughout the population, convincing animals that their social positions are cosmically predetermined rather than politically constructed. Prey animals accept their subordinate status because questioning it would mean questioning divine wisdom. Lower-ranking lions defer to royal bloodlines because challenging hereditary privilege supposedly disrupts ancestral plans. Consider what happens to characters who express skepticism about the great king's mythology. They get marginalized, villainized, or subjected to intensive spiritual intervention designed to restore their faith. The system cannot tolerate open disbelief because it threatens the entire foundation of political legitimacy. Characters who question spiritual authority inevitably find themselves positioned as threats to social stability rather than voices for rational governance. Scar represents perhaps the most fascinating case study in this regard. His cynicism about the great kings and circle of life philosophy gets presented as evidence of his evil nature. But what if his skepticism reflects genuine insight into the system's deceptive nature? Scar's famous dismissal of the circle of life, calling it a meaningless line of chatter, might represent the only honest assessment of this spiritual propaganda that we hear in the entire franchise. The timing of Scar's revelation becomes particularly significant when viewed through this lens. He exposes the circle of life as manufactured nonsense precisely when he's positioning himself to overthrow the existing power structure. His skepticism about spiritual justifications for royal authority correlates directly with his willingness to challenge political arrangements that benefit others at his expense. The narrative frames this as villainy, but it might actually represent the closest thing to revolutionary consciousness that appears in these films. This raises disturbing questions about how the great king's mythology shapes our understanding of legitimate political opposition. Characters who accept spiritual authority get portrayed as good, while those who question it become villains. This framing prevents audiences from considering whether some challenges to royal authority might be justified, regardless of the spiritual beliefs involved. The psychological manipulation becomes even more sinister when examining how it affects characters making life-altering decisions based on fabricated spiritual guidance. Simba abandons his exile and returns to confront dangerous political situations because he believes his deceased father commanded it. Kiara accepts romantic relationships and political alliances because spiritual visions suggest they're cosmically ordained. These characters risk their lives and sacrifice their autonomy based on encounters that exist only in their own traumatized psyches. Think about the human cost of this deception. Characters spend years processing guilt, grief, and uncertainty that could be resolved through honest emotional support and practical guidance. Instead, they get fed spiritual fantasies that provide temporary comfort while preventing genuine healing. Simba's extended exile and self-imposed suffering stem directly from his belief that he's disappointed divine ancestors who never actually communicated any expectations to him. The great king's mythology also prevents the development of more sophisticated political systems that could better serve the Pride Land's population. Democratic decision-making gets dismissed because royal bloodlines supposedly carry divine authority. Checks and balances on royal power are unnecessary because kings receive guidance from omniscient ancestors. Social reform becomes impossible because existing arrangements reflect cosmic will rather than human choices. International relations suffer under this spiritual framework as well. The Pride Lands can't develop equal partnerships with neighboring territories because their political system depends on claims of divine superiority. Other animal societies that don't recognize the great kings get positioned as spiritually inferior, preventing diplomatic relationships based on mutual respect and shared interests. The educational implications are equally devastating. Young animals learn to defer to authority rather than developing critical thinking skills. They're taught to seek spiritual guidance for decisions they could make through reason and experience. This intellectual dependency ensures that future generations will be just as susceptible to manipulation as their parents, perpetuating the cycle of spiritual control indefinitely. Perhaps most tragic is how this system corrupts genuine spiritual experience. Characters who might develop authentic connections to nature, meaningful philosophical frameworks, or profound personal growth instead get fed manufactured encounters designed to serve political purposes. Their spiritual lives become tools for others' agenda rather than sources of genuine wisdom and personal development. The great king's deception represents totalitarian control disguised as benevolent guidance. It eliminates political opposition by making dissent equivalent to spiritual rebellion. It prevents social progress by framing existing inequalities as cosmic necessity. It destroys individual autonomy by convincing characters that their most important decisions should be based on fabricated divine intervention, rather than their own judgment and values. When you strip away the manufactured spiritual encounters, political manipulation, and psychological control mechanisms, what remains is both beautiful and heartbreaking. Those stars that characters gaze upon while seeking ancestral guidance? They're simply stars, distant suns burning in the vastness of space, indifferent to earthly politics and royal bloodlines. The night sky that Mufasa once showed Simba contains no deceased kings watching over the Pride Lands. It holds only the same cosmic wonder that has inspired countless species across millions of years, requiring no supernatural interpretation to be profound. This realization transforms our understanding of every character's spiritual journey. Simba's growth from traumatized exile to confident leader had nothing to do with paternal guidance from beyond. His strength came from within, from processing his grief, confronting his fears, and choosing to take responsibility for his community's welfare. The wisdom he thought came from the great kings actually emerged from his own moral development and emotional healing. The tragedy isn't that he lacked divine support, but that he was prevented from recognizing his own resilience and capability. Consider the psychological damage inflicted on characters who structured their entire lives around fabricated spiritual experiences. Simba spent years believing he had disappointed cosmic ancestors, who never actually set any expectations for him. His guilt and self-imposed exile stemmed from trying to meet standards that existed only in his manipulated psyche. Kiara made major life decisions based on spiritual visions that reflected others' political agenda, rather than genuine divine guidance. These characters sacrificed their autonomy and suffered unnecessary emotional torment because they trusted in carefully constructed illusions. The removal of this false belief system would fundamentally transform Pride Land society. Without claims of divine authority, royal power would need to be earned through competent governance rather than inherited through bloodline. Political decisions would require rational justification rather than spiritual validation. Social hierarchies would need to prove their practical value rather than claiming cosmic necessity. The entire population would be forced to develop critical thinking skills and personal responsibility, rather than deferring to fabricated ancestral wisdom. But perhaps the most tragic casualties of this spiritual deception are the characters who never realized their full potential because they were taught to seek external validation rather than developing internal strength. How many animals accepted subordinate positions because they believed the great kings ordained their inferior status? How many potential leaders never emerged because they were convinced that royal bloodlines carried divine superiority? How many innovative solutions to social problems never developed because existing arrangements supposedly reflected ancestral wisdom? The real source of wisdom and moral guidance that characters needed was always available to them, through empathy, reason, experience, and genuine community connection. Simba's best decisions came from understanding other characters' perspectives and considering the practical consequences of his actions. Kiara's growth resulted from forming authentic relationships across social boundaries and questioning inherited prejudices. The strength they attributed to spiritual intervention actually emerged from very human capacities for learning, adaptation, and moral development. This raises the most disturbing possibility of all. Some characters might know the great king's mythology is fabricated, but continue perpetuating it anyway. Rafiki's sophisticated understanding of psychological manipulation suggests he recognizes the artificial nature of the spiritual encounters he orchestrates. Did Mufasa himself understand that royal authority required spiritual legitimation to maintain popular support? Do successive kings participate in this deception knowingly, viewing it as a necessary tool for maintaining social stability? If so, then the Pride Lands operate under a conspiracy of silence, where those in power protect each other's deceptions while exploiting the genuine faith of their subjects. The spiritual advisors, royal families, and political elites might form an interconnected web of mutual deception, each group maintaining the other's credibility while privately understanding the artificial nature of their entire spiritual framework. The implications extend far beyond the Pride Lands themselves. This analysis raises questions about every Disney narrative that uses spiritual or magical elements to validate existing power structures. How many other animated films employ supernatural justification for social hierarchies that might not withstand rational examination? How often do Disney stories use spiritual frameworks to prevent characters from questioning political arrangements that benefit some groups at others' expense? Beauty and the Beast presents a curse that can only be broken through true love, But what if this magical framework obscures an abusive relationship dynamic? Frozen uses mystical powers to explore themes of self-acceptance. But do these supernatural elements prevent deeper examination of how society treats individuals who don't conform to expectations? The Little Mermaid employs magical transformation to enable cross-species romance. But might this fantasy element distract from questions about cultural assimilation and identity sacrifice? The Great King's deception reveals how spiritual narratives can be weaponized to maintain control while providing the illusion of meaning and guidance. Characters believe they're receiving profound cosmic wisdom when they're actually being fed carefully constructed propaganda designed to serve others' political interests. Their genuine spiritual needs get exploited to ensure compliance with social arrangements that might not survive honest examination. Yet perhaps the most hopeful aspect of this analysis is what it reveals about the character's true strength and resilience. Every moment of growth, courage, and moral development that gets attributed to spiritual intervention actually demonstrates the incredible capacity for positive change that exists within these individuals themselves. Simba didn't need divine approval to become a good king. He possessed the empathy, intelligence, and determination required for effective leadership. Kiara didn't require ancestral guidance to build bridges across social divisions. She had the wisdom and compassion necessary for meaningful reconciliation. The stars are still beautiful without containing the spirits of deceased monarchs. The natural world remains worthy of respect and wonder without requiring supernatural interpretation. The bonds between characters retain their power and meaning without needing cosmic validation. What's lost when the Great King's mythology crumbles isn't genuine spirituality or moral guidance. It's a system of control that prevented characters from recognizing their own strength and prevented society from evolving beyond primitive power. Structures. The real question isn't whether the Great Kings exist, but whether we're ready to examine what lies beneath the spiritual narratives that shape our understanding of authority, tradition, and social change. Sometimes the most profound truth is that we never needed the lie in the first place.